Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Bhavabhuti, whom I'm reading about in the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So Bhavabhuti was a Hindu Brahmin who was, so if you don't know anything about the Hindu caste system, the traditional Indian caste system, Brahmins are at the top or near the top. They tend to be religious leaders, they tend to be court officials, they tend to be extremely well educated and cultured, things like this. And so Bhavabhuti is from a very privileged background. He's an extremely interesting writer in the classical Indian or Sanskrit tradition. And again, as with all of the other poets I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology, there's a very small number of poems, just 4 of them reproduced here. But his poems are very interesting because he actually seems to have these very modernist themes in a lot of his work. So, for instance, and these are actually themes that can connect to Shakespeare's poetry as well, in some cases. But we think about like high modernists, people like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Virginia Woolf, writers like this, James Joyce, who are in this sort of 1920s, 30s, up through the 50s vein. Bhavabhuti is dealing with some of the same kind of themes and concerns that they're dealing with. So, for instance, in this poem, which is just marked 753, he writes, "A flood of tears blurs my vision time and again. My limbs, numb from imagining her, are paralyzed. My hand here breaks into a sweat. My fingers tremble as I try to paint my love. Tell me, how am I to do it?" So this idea of the crisis of creation, the crisis of art, and the difficulty of expressing the truth, expressing emotion, expressing things in an effective and compelling way is very, very central to the modernist crisis. So this idea of like, not just I lack the skill to paint the portrait of my love, the physicality of it. My hands break into a sweat. My fingers tremble. That idea of like creation as such a visceral, physical reaction or experience is very, I think, linked to the modernists. We've also got this element of a sort of future orientation. Well, no, I'll talk about that in just a second, actually. I'll talk about this other one, poem 783 in this collection, because this is another one that's very clear, has very sort of clear thematic resonances with what the modernists would later be interested in, namely the loss of identity and the blending of identity. Interpersonal connections, particularly, as undermining the sort of boundaries of the self. So this is poem 783. My love is married to me as though she had melted into my mind, or was reflected in it, or painted on it, or sculpted in it, or set in it like a gem, or cemented to it, or engraved upon it, or as if she were nailed to it by the 5 arrows of the god of love, or finely woven into the threads of the very fabric of its thought. So again, that idea of like intermeshed identity is interesting. It's something that the modernists are concerned with, and what it means to be not necessarily just in romantic relationships, but what it means to be part of a society or to interact with other people. But the other thing that's interesting here is stylistically, this list of things, of analogies that make up the body of the poem. That's a very modernist technique as well. This idea of just, I'm going to list and list and list and list. And that's what the poem is about. Like, that sort of technique is something the modernists do to challenge the way that poetry is traditionally written. And Bhavabhuti is doing it here to explore this romantic relationship. It's very, very interesting. And then the last poem in this collection, I skipped the first one because I think it's the least interesting of these four for me. But the last poem in this collection, which is labeled 731, this is about the difficulty of finding an audience who understands or appreciates the artist's vision. And we get this again with Shakespeare as well. So this is something that Shakespeare deals with in his sonnets. But this idea of like the masses don't get art is something we do see in the modernists. Particularly, I think people like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and people like this. So the poem goes like this. The people in this world who scorn me no doubt have a special wisdom, so I don't write for them. Instead, I write with the thought that since the world is wide and time is endless, one day someone will be born whose nature is the same as mine. So this idea of sort of future-orientedness is very important, again, to the modernists, very important to the modernists, because so much of modernist experience was about loss and destruction and the breakdown of culture and things like this. So that idea of like looking forward, but also the modernists were esoteric in many cases, especially people like James Joyce, people like Eliot. These were people who loved obscure references, who loved a sort of cosmopolitan approach. The Wasteland, for instance, by T.S. Eliot, takes from Buddhism, takes from Hinduism, takes from Latin, takes from all of these different sources, mythological, literary, religious, spiritual, etc., and pulls them all together. It's almost impossible to read and really appreciate the poem without extensive footnotes. So this idea of like, I'm writing for people who can get what I'm doing and appreciate what I'm doing is something that I think the modernists would be very much on board with in many cases. This idea of art is not meant to be the lowest common denominator. It's not a Hallmark greeting card or something like this. Art is unique and visionary and expressive and things like this. And I think that's what Bhavabhuti is getting at here. And again, I think he's a very, very interesting poet because of the themes that he's dealing with that in some cases are so much different than what a lot of other like 7th and 8th century Indian poets seem to be writing about.